Hi, and welcome to Postscript. I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and it's great to have you with us here. We're coming to you from Berkeley Springs in West Virginia, and we do this every month or so when we have speakers in town for our Berkeley Springs Transition Talks. This is a series that we do that features thinkers and idea people and doers who are playing some kind of an important kind of role in shaping and explicating where the world is going and what this new world and this new human is going to be like. And today we're very pleased to have Dr. Paul H. Smith with us. Paul is one of the original remote viewers from the military's program of using psychic spies to spy on the Soviet Union, China, and other such places. And it's great to have you with us today.
I am really thrilled to be here,
yeah,
John.
This
is awesome.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit, give us a little bit background for folks who are not familiar with what remote viewing was. Just kind of a Cliff Notes kind of run at it.
Okay. You know, I've always wondered who Cliff was.
Yeah,
who was
Cliff?
Yeah. So, briefly, the U.S. intelligence apparatus was really worried about what the Soviets were involved in the late 60s, early 70s, because they were doing massive research on what we would consider paranormal kinds of subjects. And so the CIA funded a program, started at SRI International, this massive government think tank in California, and to research this material. And out of that came this skill known as remote viewing, which is essentially an ESP-based, sort of a form of clairvoyance, maybe disciplined clairvoyance would be a good way of saying it. And then that was used during pretty much the rest of the Cold War, altogether about 23 years, to spy on the Soviets or the Hezbollah or narco traffickers or whoever the bad guys were at that time, or whoever we thought were bad guys. Yeah. It was very successful in some respects. It didn't work all the time.
Right. Kind of like life.
Well, kind of like any intelligence discipline, right? No intelligence discipline works all the time. But it was, what was surprising is that it did indeed absolutely work on a number of occasions, and it was useful in our intelligence collection and defense efforts.
Well, the thing that's fascinating to me about it, and that got my attention early on in the early 90s, was that you essentially could look inside of a locked, dark room, and golly, who else can do that? So I mean, it's worth at least a data point, and in this particular case, it's worth a whole lot more data points, because I know, not as much as you, of course, about some of the extraordinary kind of successes you have. Now, you were in the Army. This was an Army program at one point, in the CIA and so on?
Well, the way it worked is the Army found out that this research was going on, and they decided they wanted a piece of it. And so they started their own program, and I got recruited into that. A little bit later down the line, it got transferred to the Defense Intelligence Agency. And then at the very end in 1995, it was transferred to the Central Intelligence Agency, which immediately shut it down. So the irony about this is that even though it's called the CIA program, the CIA never actually ran it.
Well, that's interesting. So talk to us about how it started, and then we'll get into a little bit about some experiences.
The first, there's a gentleman named Ingo Swann, who was an artist and also a researcher in New York. And he developed this, he did a lot of research with some of the prominent people exploring ESP and the paranormal. Gertrude Schmeidler at the City College of New York, Carlos Osas at the American Society of Psychical Research. He was involved with them, and he came up with this new research paradigm that he ultimately named remote viewing. And
now he was a famous psychic too.
He was, he became quite famous ultimately, and quite successful too. Yeah. He wasn't one of your 1-900 psychics. He was a legitimate psychic, right? So he and a physicist named Harold Puthoff out at SRI, through a very complicated set of circumstances, ended up doing an experiment together. This is before the CIA even knew these guys were involved. And that experiment was really successful, and Hal actually just sent out a letter to a few of his friends explaining what had happened, and somebody at the CIA got a hold of it.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, we need these guys to explore what it is the Soviets are doing.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of how we got
Hal
going.
has been one of our transition talk
Oh,
speakers
awesome.
back quite some time ago, and it's been a big hit. And I mean, he keeps telling me every time I see him, the video that we put up, he says people keep talking to him.
I think I might have seen that video. Yeah.
So now you were a major in the Army, right?
Yep.
And so you're a serious kind of guy. I mean, you got a PhD in.
I like to tell people I have a PhD. That's a doctorate of philosophy in philosophy.
Oh,
from the University of Texas.
I see. So I mean, you don't have a tinfoil hat or any kind of weird stuff.
No, I sometimes wish I did.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like
My head gets cold
so
sometimes.
So how did this change your life? I mean, was this new? I mean, were you playing in this space before?
I had never had a psychic experience in my life. I had never heard the words remote and viewing together. I had no idea it existed. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, apparently with the right skill set that they evaluated as being promising as a remote viewer. They're actually looking for military intelligence officers who are otherwise qualified in their career, but had a unique set of interests beyond military or intelligence, like studio art or languages, of course, kind of natural, but studio art, languages, creative writing, any of these kind of creative pursuits. And it so happened that I had studied art in college. I was fluent or competent in 3 other languages. I liked to write fiction that kept getting rejected by the publishers. And I had been playing guitar they like music ability as well. And all of those things kind of came together, and they found that out about me, and they invited me to join this program.
So how did it change your life when you figured out that this, I mean, you probably didn't have this mindset or this worldview? Or
No. Well, I had explored the idea of ESP when I was a kid. I liked science fiction that had mental, powers involved and that kind of thing. But I had been involved in a science fair project in junior high involving the Zener cards, the little cards with the wavy lines and the star and all of that stuff, the little ESP kind of testing cards.
Okay.
Yeah. You see it at the beginning of Ghostbusters,
But
that had totally failed. I had absolutely no success at that. And so I'd come to the conclusion there probably wasn't anything to it.
Right.
I mean, that's the data point of 1, which was kind of not a particularly scientific decision, but I came to that conclusion. So when they pitched me with this, I go, wow, this stuff really is real. I've got to do it. And so it changed my career, certainly. I was in a fairly boring desk job evaluating Middle Eastern intelligence reports at the time. And then I got to do this really exciting thing for 7 years.
So after 6 months or a year or something like that, how did it change your kind of worldview?
Well, first off, I came to realize that we really truly are more than just our physical bodies. That's a thing that Bob Monroe talks about. But really, our capacities don't stop with the outside of our skulls.
Right.
We really can transcend space and time mentally, because I had the evidence for that. I mean, I had actually done it. I knew when we did a remote viewing session what I knew, which was nothing about the target. And I knew what I had developed during the course of that in double-blind circumstances where nobody else knew what the target was either. And I had produced legitimate information, very, very strongly indicative of that I'd gotten real information from the target. That's really hard to say there was nothing going on. Yeah. So I had really good evidence, and that happened time after time after time. So at that point, it became probably, if there's anything in the world I believe, it's this. There's lots of other things I'm skeptical of, but I absolutely know this works.
Yeah. So tell me about the process. So how did it work when they came to you with a target, or how did the whole thing go?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of different modes. There's the research mode, there's the training mode, and then there's the operational. So I'll talk operational because that's what most people are interested in, what we really did stuff. Yeah. They would come to us they used to bring geographic coordinates.
Right.
They'd come to a geographic coordinate.
And who's they?
Are the taskers, the people who are managing.
From the different militaries and from other.
So we'll go back even another level. Okay. So what happened is an agency out there, like it might be ITAC, the Threat and Analysis Center, or it might be one of the services like the Air Force or somebody, would have a task that they could not get resolved any other way. Their other intelligence technologies were not successful in giving them the information they needed. So they would pass that request down through the channels down to our office, and then we had a project manager who sometimes knew what the target was, sometimes didn't.
All right.
But they would formulate we call it a coordinate. Ultimately, we did start with geographic coordinates, but later we went to these just random numbers.
Right.
And they'd pass that to a monitor, and the monitor and the viewer would go work this session.
Right. Now,
so
it's important you didn't, the viewer had
no
idea.
No idea what the target is. And there's a reason for it. It's not so that you can cheat like the skeptics think. It's because if you have an idea what the target is,
Then
your brain starts making stuff up, and it ends up creating what we call noise,
Right.
more mental noise that makes it harder to remote view, not easier.
Hmm.
So we prefer to be completely blind, or as blind as possible to
Okay.
this process,
Right.
right? So then the viewer would sit down, monitor is there just to make
So you
sure.
just sit in a chair.
That's right. It's kind of boring, actually. Kind of like watching paint dry if you're out here, right? So you're sitting at one end of the table, the monitor's at the other end of the table. There are other modes, but this
Yeah.
is the one we worked. You have a stack of paper and a pen, and when you get that number that stands for do the session, then you start working.
So 3526 or something like that. Or,
Usually there's a few more digits,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that's the
but
idea.
yeah.
Well, I like to use 8675309. Yeah.
Sounds like a song to me.
It is, yes. Numbers on the wall. Yeah,
Okay, all right.
No, but just to stand in as a random number,
Yeah.
8675309. You write that down. You start getting perceptions. It might be like colors, smells, tastes, textures, that kind of thing, and then you get more
You close your
refined.
eyes?
Some people do. I generally didn't.
Make the room kind of quiet and turn off the lights and stuff.
We actually worked in a room that was all gray. Everything was gray and adjustable lighting. Although you can do this in any setting pretty much.
Yeah.
You don't want to do it in a noisy bar
Right,
or whatever,
right. Okay.
but you can do it mostly anywhere. So then you start going, you get these first perceptual input, and then gradually things start developing and getting more complex, and you start making sketches of the target. And then you get more complex,
So what's the monitor
abstract
doing?
stuff. Well, normally the monitor isn't doing anything if you're an experienced viewer. In a training setting, they're reminding you what comes next,
I see.
right?
Okay,
In terms
okay.
of what you're supposed to do. In an operational setting, you kind of skew towards your right brain. I hate to talk
Yeah.
simplistically, but it's like that, right? You skew towards your right brain. The monitor may hear you say something and think, now there might be something important there, and they might bring you back to that to explore that. Even though they don't know what the target is, what you say starts to kind of form a context, and you may say something that the monitor identifies as, that's the kind of information that our customer may want to know, right?
Yeah.
And so it might bring you around. So they provide some ancillary help, right? If you go all the way to stage 6, you actually can make a three-dimensional clay model of the target. It's like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right?
So then you write it up or something, or how do you brief it to the client or
Well, what
customer?
happens is then the viewer, they will write up a summary and then package the whole thing and give it to the monitor.
Okay.
The monitor passes it to the project officer. The project officer takes all of the viewer's
so they do
results.
multiple guys looking at the same thing?
Depending on the target.
Yeah.
Right. Some targets they only had one or two do. Some of them they had all of us work, depending on how important
And
it
the
was.
client or the
complicated.
customer would say, this is really important, so you need to put a lot of guys on it or something? or
Well,
what?
usually the project manager will have at least an idea of what kind of a target it is, and he'll know if it's
okay,
complicated
all
or
right.
not, right?
Okay.
But of course
So
he
the
doesn't.
project manager is two people.
Two
or
tiers
three-
up.
Yeah, right.
So that's how you get the double blind.
Yeah.
You don't tell the monitor. As a project manager, you don't tell the monitor what you know. All you do is give that monitor the
Got it.
the coordinate,
All
right?
So tell us the secrets. Tell us what you found. Tell us the cool things.
We found. Oh no, you got to tell me. You got to come to my presentation. I'll show you
I'll be
pictures.
there.
Yeah.
I promise.
Yeah, I mean, we did all kinds of things. And they targeted us on some. Some we were more successful on than others. We were targeted on, before I joined the unit, but on the Iran hostage situation, but trying to track down where hostages were in the conditions. And a lot of the data, they were never able to evaluate, because obviously we didn't have that kind of information available before or after. Some of the stuff they were able to evaluate as being accurate. because we never actually went in to rescue them, tried and failed, but never went in to rescue them, it's hard to say if that information would help. But that's one example. We reported on Chinese nuclear tests, some of which were successful, some of our remote viewing.
Like what?
Well, there's one in Lop Nor. So that was, of course, the Chinese testing facility. But they had, the Chinese had let me make sure I got the right nationality. I'm pretty sure it was the Chinese. They tested a weapon, and it was kind of a dud. The initiating charge went off, but the nuke itself didn't, or it went subcritical or something. I don't know exactly what happened. That was also before my time. But the viewer said, well, they have this test, and it involves an explosion, and it isn't what they expected. It's kind of a, well, he didn't use the word dud, but that's the word. It's kind of a dud. But they're all celebrating.
Yeah, right.
Right? And it turned out, indeed, that was what happened. It had been a failure in the major respects, but it was a massive breakthrough in some respects. Maybe the triggering system actually worked.
Yeah.
It's just that the weapon didn't work, right? And they were actually, Chinese actually were celebrating that event.
All right.
So that's one example.
So you could go backward, therefore, and look at that.
Yeah.
You could go forward in time?
You can with more limitations.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So the way remote viewing acts is that the future hasn't happened yet.
Of course.
Yeah. Now, there are people who believe it has. There are people who believe that time is fixed and that you could. But the way it works is we are roughly 70% accurate, plus or minus, present and past. Mm-hmm. But that drops dramatically to like maybe 5% accurate trying to go into the future. It's as if there's all these possible futures out there, and sometimes we pick the right one and sometimes we pick the wrong one, right? There are actually modalities to help with certain kinds of predictive things into the future that are just as accurate as present and past. But generally speaking, we did a lot of attempts at predicting future events that may occur, and it didn't work very well.
Well, some of them,
Sometimes
Ingo tells a story about seeing the satellite that was going to what?
Jupiter.
Jupiter. And
yeah, although you could look at that a couple of different ways. You could look at it as precognitive.
Tell the story.
Okay. So Ingo Swann, again, the guy who started all this ultimately, there was and I forget which one it was, a Voyager or a Pioneer or something like that, a space probe that was going to do a flyby of Jupiter. But it was months down the road.
Right.
And before it would get there. And so somebody came up with the idea, well, why didn't we have Ingo Swann remote view the planet to come up with the kinds of things that the probe might find, right? So he remote viewed Jupiter, and he came up with a lot of comments about it and stuff, but one of the key things he said that was totally discounted, it couldn't possibly be true, is that Jupiter has rings.
Right.
Well, everybody thought, no, Saturn has rings, Jupiter doesn't have rings, right? Well, when that space vehicle flew by, it discovered that Jupiter does have rings. They're edge on, and they're a lot thinner, I guess, but we can't see them from here, and we did not detect them. But it turned out that the spacecraft did show those rings, so Ingo was completely correct. But now, was that something?
And Carl Sagan was wrong.
Of course. Well, he was wrong a lot. And, not to say that the rest of us aren't wrong either, but
no, because as the story goes, when he saw that, then he sent a note out or some kind of to Carl Sagan, and Carl Sagan says, "Nah," and then it turns around that it's really
that's funny.
Really
yeah.
True.
So, but the question here, though, is was that precognitive? In other words, did he predict it, or was he remote viewing Jupiter at the time? So it was a real-time thing that they just discovered later.
Flying in with the satellite, and but anyway.
Well, and that could be the way he did that. And still be real time. There's some things about this that we don't know, and we probably won't ever be able to disentangle.
Well, I want you to come and explain that, but tell us at least one or two other stories about things that you found that are interesting.
Well, I'm going to stick with the prediction thing here, because there was an event that I remote viewed that did turn out precognitive. And so on a Friday in May of 1987, I had a monitor take me over to the building, and he wanted me to remote view. It turns out, of course, I didn't know. All I got was the number, right? But I found out later what he wanted me to remote view is any event of significance that was going to occur that was important to us within the next few days. I think it was vague like that, of next few days. So I just started describing a ship in a closed body of water at night, sailing along, and it reminded me of an American destroyer, and I got the impression of an aircraft a long distance away circling around, and then this aircraft drops these two cylindrical things with little fins that make roaring noises that flew around. I say two, one and then maybe two, fly around, and then the ship and these things come together, and there's mayhem and smoke and flames, and the ship leans over, and all this kind of stuff, and there's much more to it.
Yeah.
But my monitor thought I was going to describe some other event, and so he said, "Oh, I'm afraid you're off. Let's go home for the day." It was Friday afternoon, right? So I lock it in my safe. I go home, and Monday morning I get up and I'm getting my kids off to school, and our operations officer, Skip Adler, calls and says, "Hey, Paul, where's that session you did on Friday?" And I said, "Well, it's in my safe drawer. Why do you care? I was off." He said, "You haven't read the papers yet." So I open up the Washington Post. U.S. frigate hit by Exocet missiles fired by an Iraqi jet.
Wow.
And I mean, I'm going, whoa.
Yeah.
I mean, we were getting used to being amazed, but this even amazed me, right?
Yeah.
And a year later, I was taking an indications and warning class at the Defense Intelligence College, and I got the after-action report on this event. And I was able to compare that to my session and discover that it was 100% correct. There was nothing that was in, small tiny details like names and stuff wasn't there. But the events as described in the after-action report match perfectly what I had described in my session. So I consider that the best session I ever did.
Wow.
It was just amazing. Yeah.
I mean, the viewers could find a submarine at the bottom of the ocean, right?
Yes, in principle you can. I mean, there's some difficulties associated with that, but in principle you can. Yeah.
So how does it all work? I mean, why does...
Hey, if I knew that, I'd be even richer than I am now, which is not very rich at all. Yeah.
What do you think?
There's a lot of speculation about it.
I mean, you ran 45, or you ran a couple dozen people through there were viewers. So I mean, this is real, and you found out that the Russians or the Soviets had a deal doing it. So there's no question.
So there's two ways to. Yeah, that's right. There's no. I mean, the evidence is really, really strong. Yeah. You'll find a lot of skeptics who try and say no, it's not, but they just haven't looked at the evidence. There's a ton of really good evidence. Yeah. So how does it work? Well, there's two ways of saying how does it work, as in how do you do it?
Right.
That I can explain.
Right.
How does it work in terms of what's the causality, what are the physics, if there are physics involved, all that. That I can only give you conjecture and speculation. Now, the current contender for a physical explanation is this idea of non-locality quantum entanglement. And right now there are a lot of questions that hypothesis can't answer in terms of what remote viewing does. But they're getting, for one thing, they're discovering that quantum entanglement doesn't just happen at the micro scale, but it actually seems to be occurring even at the macro, Newtonian level, right? So ultimately, maybe that will explain it. I have my doubts. There are, of course, the more metaphysical woo-woo kind of explanations in which it's a non-physical aspect of our human nature, and in some way we're able to then connect with the universe that way. If that's the case, we won't come up with a physical explanation for it, right?
Right.
But nonetheless, I can tell you how to do it, but I can't give you a full story on how it actually works at the nuts and bolts level.
Do you think anybody can learn how to do this?
Pretty much. It's a lot like musical ability, right? So, of course, a lot of people say, well, I don't have the musical talent. That's really not quite true. Just about anybody can learn to be musical if they dedicate the effort and they get taught correctly. Right. They may not become concert pianists, but they can play the piano well enough to accompany the choir or whatever, right? But you have to have the commitment to do that. Remote viewing is a lot like that. There are probably a few people who can't, like, you can't play the piano if you have no fingers, right? There are some people who probably don't have the cognitive ability, like they may be low performing folks with mental issues or whatever. Or they may have personality issues that makes them, like I suspect that someone with a strong case of ADD might have trouble with it, right? But generally speaking, the vast majority of normal people can learn how to do it adequately as they apply themselves. Have you ever heard of
blind people being able to do this or anything like that?
There's been talk about that, and there's been no consistent research in it. It would be interesting. I think it would be interesting to do something like that to test the ability. There are some.
You'd have to have somebody that had sight beforehand, so that you had a datum so they could decolor.
Yes. The more interesting case is somebody who'd been blind from birth.
Yeah, but then what's green? I mean, who knows?
Well, you know, there are other things involved in remote viewing that don't involve just colors, right?
Well,
so
I know, but
if they might be able to report a non-visual thing. But here's the really interesting thing. If it turns out that in the process of remote viewing, they actually do have a visual experience, they may not be able to tell you this is green, but they'll say they can tell you things that indicate that they are experiencing something visually. That would be intriguing.
yeah.
But the research hasn't been done, so I don't know.
I wonder how you describe something you've never seen.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, I don't know. Let's play around with it.
let's understand. So what do you think remote viewing says about the future and what might be coming?
Well, I think the important thing about remote viewing, and whether or not this affects our future or not, depends on how many people get into the field. But the thing about that remote viewing does is it tells us that we are, and this is a whole dimension of human capability that so far science and mainstream culture rejects as a possibility.
Right.
And yet, look at what it says about humans, that we are more than our physical bodies, we are able to transcend space and time, at least
Yep.
mentally. What does that say about some of the trivial things we get involved in
Oh,
these
no
days?
kidding.
You know, if we, in fact, the one thing probably is giving more global, you know, my experience with remote viewing is giving more a global appreciation of the world. And people who get involved in remote viewing in an objective way,
Right.
who aren't just in it to make money, and some people do make money with it, people who are into it, you know, to allow that openness to occur, it does change their lives in a positive way. They become less concerned with the trivia, they become more concerned about other people in a positive way. It just makes them better people in general. And if the whole world got on that bandwagon, we would see a lot less turmoil and strife.
So do you see any kind of indications or trends that point toward an expansion of this ability or an awareness or other kind of things? I mean, is this an interesting kind of contributing factor to this emergent kind of big change to a new world?
Well, I think it is certainly in some quadrants, but how it's going to work out remains to be seen. Because a lot of people get involved in it because they're getting all excited about remote viewing aliens and conspiracy theories, right? To me,
Is that possible? Can you do that?
well, you can do it, but whether or not you can trust the data is another matter.
But that would be the case in any case, wouldn't it?
Well, okay, so here's the issue. If you remote view something that doesn't exist, then it's like dividing by zero. You can get anything, right? And oftentimes, if you like remote view a UFO event that actually never happened, and there's a lot of those out there. People claim that they had UFO experiences and they didn't, right? So you remote view something like that, you're likely to actually report on the most powerful psychic signal, which is the beliefs or the prejudices of the person who claims that it happened.
Yeah.
And so you end up describing the event as they think it happened, and you haven't confirmed anything except their own delusions, right? But you don't know that because you don't know what the causal connections are. That's why I tend to prefer just to remote view concrete things that you can't ultimately get feedback from, because then you can trace whether you're on or not.
Can other people in the room influence?
Yes, there's a thing called telepathic overlay. Yeah, which sometimes somebody's strong beliefs may leak into somebody else's strong beliefs may leak into your session.
God, what's that say about reality?
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Well, the interesting thing about that is I generally find that well-disciplined, well-trained viewers don't fall victim to that kind of a thing. They generally are quite good about sticking with what it is they're supposed to be doing. But it can happen, particularly in people who are just starting out.
Right. So is it expanding? Are there more people getting involved?
Interestingly, yeah, of course the really big expansion was the late 90s. That's first when it became known, and also that's when radio shows like Coast to Coast came on and featured a lot of remote viewers, and you had the internet just spreading all this stuff, and it just
and then declassification. I mean,
well, that's what made that possible.
Thousands, yeah.
And
I mean, there's 85,000 documents that are declassified now, or something.
12,500.
You think that's all? Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, I have to say there's been another declassification that I've got copies of, but that was only about another 1,200.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
There are more that are still classified, largely probably because they involve other sources and methods they don't want to reveal. But there are also some of our best results are still classified. There's a thing called the Red Book that Hal Puthoff keeps trying to find, in which they put their, their best hits, a whole series of best hits, and that one he's not been able to locate.
Well, we can talk about that next time.
Okay, sounds good.
Paul Smith, thank you for being with us. Appreciate it very much. We're going to have a good day today here in Berkeley Springs. And thank you for being with us here on Postscript. Come back again. We'll have a number of wonderful speakers coming up in the coming months here in our little town in Berkeley Springs that's 100 miles from Washington and 100 miles from Baltimore. And so I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and thank you for being with us.